welcome to the Thursday edition of Ball with Y'all. Hope you're all having a wonderful week so far, and I hope you're ready for yet another full weekend of football over the next few days. In fact, the NFL season starts tonight, too, as the reigning champs, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, take on the Dallas Cowboys. So we're all in store for a lot over the next 96 hours or so. Of course, we've already had an interesting week in the college football world. Last time we talked, Ole Miss had not kicked off yet. Of course, they demolished Louisville on Monday night, Labor Day evening, 43-24, and Ole Miss's offense was everything that we've come to expect, even without Lane Kiffin on the sidelines. You might recall that Kiffin missed the game as a result of a mild COVID case. On the other hand, Ole Miss's defense was kind of surprising. They kept Louisville in check most of the night. They forced Louisville into obvious passing situations. And throughout the evening, it really looked like they were a pretty strong defense. Of course, it's hard to tell what Louisville's offense is actually like compared to an SEC offense at this point in time. But even still, a really strong performance from that Ole Miss defense. There were 4 total players actually ejected in the game, 2 for Louisville and 2 for Ole Miss. Luckily, those were both in the first half, so they should be all square for this week. Those players, of course, were ejected as a result of targeting, which means that tackling will most likely be a point of emphasis in practice for both teams this week. Particularly moving forward, I think Ole Miss's defense will be a point of interest as we look ahead. Last year, we saw Ole Miss could score with the best of them, but they couldn't stop anyone. And of course, toward the end, Louisville started to rack up some points, but it didn't even matter at that point. It was the third and fourth quarter. So I think that'll be an interesting theme moving forward for the Ole Miss Rebels, but even still, a very strong and impressive performance on Monday. Other things that have happened this week. We've had a number of injuries and some unique COVID situations across the country. Some prominent names. Ronnie Bell, the leading wide receiver for the Michigan Wolverines. He's out for the year. Has a knee injury. It came on a punt return. Wasn't even in a normal play on the offensive side of the ball. He had a pretty strong showing against Western Michigan in Michigan's first game. He actually had a pretty incredible catch that was called back due to a penalty. And that's going to be a sore spot for the Wolverines moving forward, and it's going to be tough to overcome for Jim Harbaugh's group. Another Big Ten team that is going to have to overcome a lack of offensive production due to injury is the Minnesota Gophers. They lost Mohamed Ibrahim. He was the Big Ten 2020 running back of the year, and he suffered a lower leg injury against Ohio State in their opener. He is also out for the year. Another player who appears to be out for the year is Clemson's safety. He's a junior. Landon Zanders. He suffered a shoulder injury against Georgia, and it appears that he is also out for the year. He was one of the top tacklers for the team. That'll also be a very sore spot moving forward for the Clemson Tigers. Lastly, from an injury standpoint, Christopher Allen. He is a Bama linebacker for the Tide. He's a former second team all SEC selection. He fractured his foot on a play that actually helped the Tide when he forced the fumble of De'Aaron King that was recovered by, I believe, Phil Mathis. He is also likely out for the year, so they're going to have to bring in most likely Drew Sanders to fill in the gap on that side of the ball. From a COVID standpoint, it came out earlier this week that Georgia's struggling. There's 4 unnamed players that will be out for the upcoming game against UAB due to COVID. Here's a quote from Kirby Smart in a recent teleconference. I'll be honest with you. I'm as concerned as I've ever been because we have 3 or 4 guys out with COVID, and we have a couple of staff members that have been out with COVID here recently. For us, we are at our highest spike, and people are talking about vaccinations. Well, these are people that are vaccinated. We're talking about breakthroughs, and so that concerns you not only for the players on your team that are unvaccinated, that are playing and not playing, because we want everyone to be safe, but it concerns me for the players that are vaccinated that we could lose them, and I think this is going to be something interesting to watch, particularly this year. Last year, there were protocols in place, and the SEC was pretty flexible when it came to COVID and players getting COVID, staffers getting COVID, coaches getting COVID, whatever else. This year, the SEC has restricted that, as has much of the NCAA from across the board, Big Ten, Pac-12, and so on. They've put together protocols in place where there's not a whole lot of wiggle room, and that's something that we're going to see here as well. In the Ole Miss case, of course, from this past Monday, they were lucky that all of their players had been vaccinated, all their staffers had been vaccinated because they didn't have to deal with all that contact tracing. And that's one benefit, of course, particularly in these locker rooms when it comes to vaccinations, And I imagine the same is true here for Georgia, since Kirby Smart mentions that these are vaccinated players, but that'll be something interesting to watch moving forward, particularly as some of these breakthrough cases that we've seen at Ole Miss and Georgia and other places, as they begin to grow in number. Moving on from COVID and injuries, we did have the AP poll, came out on Tuesday, so we haven't talked about it yet. I want to talk about it briefly. There was a lot of movement up there. Of course, the top spot is still being held on tightly by the Alabama Crimson Tide, but there's a new number 2, the Georgia Bulldogs. This is the first time they have been that high in the AP poll since 2018. They also got 4 first place votes, so they are nipping at the heels of Alabama right now. Of course, the team that they beat, the Clemson Tigers, they slipped a little bit down to number 6 in the most recent AP poll. Ohio State, the Buckeyes, they are now number 3 in the country, jumping Oklahoma, who is now number 4. We also had some movement on the lower side of the AP poll. You saw UCLA, Virginia Tech, Ole Miss, and Auburn all sneaking in after being unranked last week, all now in the top 25. Meanwhile, LSU dropped out after their loss to the UCLA Bruins. So now we have 6 SEC teams ranked in the top 25. So that's enough about the past week, the past 2 weeks, or whatever else. We're going to move on to this week, go into some games, some game predictions. Of course, I did not do well at all last week. Against the spread, I was 1-5. Against, just straight up, I was 2-4. So not a great start at all. But hey, when you're focused on what's ahead, you're not too worried about what's behind you. And I'm not worried about what's behind us. Last week is behind us. Now let's take a look at 10 of this week's most notable games. First, we'll start off with some random notable games. We'll go down to Kansas. They'll be playing number 17 Coastal Carolina. Coastal Carolina, a breakout team from last year. They're favored by 27 points. And right now the over-under sits at 53. Of course, this is a Friday night game. And as you might recall, we had a little bit of excitement last week on Friday night with Virginia Tech taking down North Carolina. I don't quite see an upset taking place here, but let's kind of get into why that is the case. Of course, Coastal Carolina, they were a breakout team last year, as I mentioned. They didn't have any trouble at all with the Citadel last week, winning 52-14. Coastal has beaten Kansas in each of the last 2 seasons, and they returned 19 of their 22 starters from a year ago. This is actually ranked 21st nationally in returning production, while Kansas is around 84th in returning production. Kansas, on the other hand, has not won back-to-back games since the 2018 season. They don't shock you on either side of the ball. They're not that great offensively. They're not that great defensively, but they're consistent, so I'll give them that. Kansas quarterback Jason Bean, he last week, 64.5% completion percentage, 163 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. I believe that Coastal will absolutely beat Kansas. There's no question about that, but I don't see it being a 4-touchdown game. I think Coastal wins, Kansas covers, and the under hits. Let's go 38-13, Coastal Carolina winning in Kansas. Now we got Appalachian State taking on the Miami Hurricanes, number 22 in the country. Miami, of course, is a 7.5-point favorite here. The over-under is sitting around 56.5. Normally, Appalachian State has an upset in mind in games like this. Last week, Appalachian State beat Eastern Carolina, the Pirates, 33-19. They looked pretty strong defensively, only giving up 381 total yards and also forced 2 turnovers. Meanwhile, Miami, of course, they got run over in their opener against Alabama. And this game will serve as a really good barometer as to what kind of team they are this year. Their defense was torn to shreds by the Crimson Tide, 501 yards allowed over that game. But on the offensive side of the ball, tempo was their friend. And it's important to sustain that 4 drives throughout the game. We kind of saw it with Ole Miss on Monday night. Tempo is the recipe to Miami's success. And De'Aaron King shows that when he's got that operating, he can't really be stopped too well. I believe that this week he'll show that they're better than they were last week, and I believe that the team will reset, beating Appalachian State here. I say Miami wins big and covers, but the under hits. Let's go 38-13. Other games that are taking place in the SEC. We got Missouri at Kentucky. Kentucky is a 4-point favorite. The over-under is sitting around 54.5. Both teams are coming off of wins, Central Michigan and Louisiana Monroe respectively, but Kentucky looked far more impressive in week 1. In the COVID-shortened season last year, Missouri came out on top against the Kentucky Wildcats, winning at home, and that snapped a 5-game win streak for the Wildcats in the series. Kentucky quarterback Will Levis, he showed impressive arm strength in week 1. Meanwhile, Missouri, they struggled defensively against Central Michigan. They gave up 475 yards, and this is against a team that didn't even have their head coach. Jim McElwain, former Alabama OC, former Florida head coach, he had an emergency appendectomy. He wasn't even on the sidelines, and his team still allotted almost 500 yards against this SEC defense. Both teams have areas of concern, but I think Kentucky has less. I'll say Kentucky wins, they cover, and they set the tone for the season. The under hits, let's go 27-20, Kentucky winning in Lexington. Moving over to Knoxville, Tennessee, where the Volunteers will be hosting the Pittsburgh Panthers. Right now, Pitt is a 3.5-point favorite. The over-under is sitting at 52.5. This is the third meeting all-time between the two schools and the first since 1983. Pittsburgh has won both previous games, which were also in Knoxville. And of course, if you look at week 1, both teams won their games. They routed their opponents, UMass and Bowling Green, respectively. And the Volunteers, they kept Bowling Green's offense from a rushing standpoint in check. Only 32 rushing yards throughout that game for the Bowling Green Falcons. Meanwhile, the Pittsburgh Panthers, they racked up 223 rushing yards and 375 passing yards against the UMass Minutemen. Pittsburgh quarterback Kenny Pickett, he is a fifth-year senior. He has 37 career starts under his belt, more than 9,000 total yards of offense. I believe that the Panthers' run defense is strong, and it's stronger than Tennessee's. While Tennessee did great last week against Bowling Green, I don't think they're going to have enough to get over Pittsburgh this week. I believe that Pittsburgh can stop the run, and they can force Tennessee quarterback Joe Milton into some pretty disastrous mistakes. Let's go Pittsburgh winning and covering, although the under will hit 31-20 Pittsburgh. Moving over to Tampa, Florida, where the USF Bulls, University of South Florida Bulls, will be taking on the number 13 Florida Gators. Of course, Florida might have their eyes on next week as they face off against the Crimson Tide, but they cannot overlook the Bulls this week. The over-under right now is sitting at 54.5. Florida is a 29-point favorite. This is the second meeting all-time between the two schools, with Florida winning the first meeting in 2010. If you're a Gator fan, though, I have some great news. South Florida is just not a good football team. Last week, they lost to NC State 45-0. Of course, they had a rough year last year. That was Jeff Scott, their head coach, his first year. This is his second year now, and he has his hands full. Their best prospect, most likely to get a win on the board early in this season, will come next week when they face off against Florida A&M. But for the Gators, this will serve as a tune-up before their big showdown next week in Gainesville. One interesting thing to watch here, there appears to be a bit of a quarterback controversy in Gainesville. Anthony Richardson, he outperformed Emory Jones in week 1. Of course, I asked some Gator fans this week, what do you think? Anthony Richardson, Emory Jones. If you asked Dan Mullen in the press conference after their week 1 game against the Florida Atlantic Owls, he kind of brushed it off. He said it was nothing. But I do think there's something there, and that'll be something interesting to watch, especially if they struggle a little bit here, if Emory Jones struggles a little bit here, and that pours into next week against the Crimson Tide. Do we see Anthony Richardson come in for the Gators wearing that famous number 15? I believe the Gators are better defensively, but it's kind of hard to tell how much better so far. And I think this game will be a good barometer on that front. I believe the Gators win and cover with the under hitting. Let's go 41-7 Gators. Another interesting non-conference game featuring an SEC team this week is number 5 Texas A&M going up to Colorado to play the Buffaloes. We've got A&M at a 17-point favorite right now. The over-under sitting around 51.5. Of course, this is a matchup of two former Big 12 teams. A&M struggled early offensively in their Week 1 game. They made a ton of mistakes in their opener against Kent State, but they still garnered nearly 600 yards in a 31-point victory. Colorado, they met expectations in week 1. It's kind of hard to judge when you play an FCS team, which was Northern Colorado. They won that game 35-7, and it appears that their offensive attack is more prominent, is stronger on the ground. Their run game is strong. As I kind of touched upon a little bit last week, Texas A&M is super young. If you look at their freshman quarterback, Haynes King, they have so much talent, but there's not a lot of experience to come along with that talent. I don't believe that inexperience will matter in this game. In fact, I believe that talent on both sides of the ball will win A&M this game. Let's go A&M winning and covering with the overhitting 41-20. Moving on to NC State. The Wolfpack going down to Starkville to play the Mississippi State Bulldogs. Right now, NC State is a 2.5-point favorite. The over-under sitting around 55.5. As I discussed earlier, NC State crushed South Florida in week 1. They had more than 250 yards of rushing. They were very balanced on both sides of the ball, and that consistency will absolutely be tested here against the Bulldogs. State, on the other side, they escaped an upset bid against Louisiana Tech, as we talked about on Monday. They had to survive a last-minute field goal attempt. They had to storm back from being down 17 in the fourth quarter. They made a ton of mistakes in that game, but they survived. I don't believe that they can afford to make those mistakes this week, and I think that NC State ultimately will take advantage of any mistake that the Bulldogs make. NC State in a shootout, I'll go them winning, them covering with the overhitting 41-37. And then our last SEC game of the week, we've got a soon-to-be SEC team in number 15 Texas going to visit Arkansas. Right now, Texas is a 6-point favorite. The over-under is sitting around 58.5. Of course, these two schools are pretty familiar with one another. Texas is 26-9 against Arkansas in Fayetteville. This is the first game, however, between the two schools since 2014 when Arkansas won 31-7. If you look at last week, Texas looked so good in their ranked matchup against Louisiana. Their sophomore running back, Bijan Robinson, he stood out. He won the Walter Camp Football Foundation National Offensive Player of the Week, that's a mouthful, award. He racked up 176 all-purpose yards, 2 touchdowns. The redshirt freshman quarterback, Hudson Card, he played pretty well in his first start, racking up 224 yards and 2 touchdowns. On the other side of the ball, for Arkansas, they struggled at first against Rice. They ended up having 31 straight points, though, to win the game, 38-17. I don't believe that they can afford another slow start in this game against the Longhorns. They need that second half effort that they had against Rice. They need it all night to overcome the Texas Longhorns. I believe that Texas has too much talent and that Bijan Robinson will continue to carry the team this weekend. Let's go Texas winning and covering with the under hitting 37-18. As far as the two big primetime games of the week, first off, we got the Battle of the State of Iowa. I think there's a better name for this, but I don't know the name, so the Battle of the State of Iowa. Number 10 Iowa at number 9 Iowa State. Right now, Iowa State is a 4-point favorite. The over-under is sitting around 44.5. If you look at the series throughout history, Iowa leads it 45-22, and they're currently on a 5-game win streak. Defense is a strength for Iowa, as is the case for most Big Ten teams, and you particularly could see that in their demolition of Indiana in week 1. Iowa, of course, is never really a sight to behold offensively, so if you want to see some points, don't watch this game. Iowa State struggled mightily against Northern Iowa last week, snuck away with a win. They were lucky to escape week 1, and week 2 is absolutely not a cupcake that they were looking for. Experience on the offensive side, particularly looking at quarterback Brock Purdy and running back Breece Hall. They have countless key positions on that side of the ball for the Cyclones, and of course, I believe in Matt Campbell as the head coach. I think they help the Cyclones bounce back mentally, physically. On that football field, I say Iowa State wins, but they do not cover. The under hits. I'll go a tight game, a low-scoring game, 17-14. And lastly, the big one, top 12 matchup here, a non-conference matchup, one that we've been waiting for quite some time. We almost got the first leg of it last year, but then COVID came around. We've got number 12 Oregon visiting number 3 Ohio State. Right now, Ohio State is a 14-point favorite. The over-under is sitting around 64 points. This is the big noon game on Fox on Saturday. If you're not familiar with Fox, their prime time slot, for whatever reason, is that noon kick. Both teams are coming off of wins, and neither of them were all that impressive. Ohio State required a second-half comeback to overcome Minnesota, while Oregon also needed a fourth-quarter comeback of their own to overcome Fresno State. Ohio State should be a much better team at home, and I believe that QB CJ Stroud will benefit from that home crowd. I do not see Ohio State struggling before the shoe. That crowd will be rocking for the first time in, 2 years? It's going to be an incredible sight to see, and you will not want to miss it as we kick off our afternoon on Saturday. Of course, on the Oregon side of the ball, we talked on Monday how Oregon's quarterback, Anthony Brown Jr., was not pleased with the offensive production. He saw there was a lot that needed to be cleaned up, and I don't see it all being cleaned up by this Saturday. I also don't see Ohio State losing their home opener. I just don't see it. It's not going to happen, especially against this Oregon team that has so many holes. I say Ohio State wins, they cover, and the over hits. Let's go 41-24, that over just hitting narrowly on that score. To recap, we're going Coastal Carolina, Miami, Kentucky, Pittsburgh, Florida, Texas A&M, NC State, Texas, Iowa State, and Ohio State. We don't have too many prominent SEC games this weekend, kind of a quiet weekend for some of the bigger fish like Georgia, Alabama, and so on, but still a lot of quality football on display as we get ready for the weeks ahead. Enjoy the games over the next couple of days, and we'll catch y'all on Monday.